Kingston, Jamaica, August 1962. The Central American and Caribbean Games are midway through their second week, and Cuba's weightlifting delegation is exactly where Fidel Castro's government placed it: attended, supervised, controlled. Castro had been investing heavily in Olympic sport as a vehicle for revolutionary prestige since taking power in 1959. His athletes traveled the world under escort, representing not just themselves, but the permanence of the regime. Defection wasn't an abstract concern in that government's calculus. It was an active political crisis. The minders were there because athletes had already been disappearing. Sergio Oliva was 21 years old, born July 4, 1941, in Pinar del Río, on the western tip of Cuba. He had served in Fulgencio Batista's army before the revolution remade the country, and then been absorbed into Castro's state weightlifting program, a program that needed competitive lifters and wasn't particularly interested in whether those lifters wanted to be there. Oliva had grown strong enough to be useful to the state, which meant the state had developed an interest in keeping him close. He had other plans. At some point during those August games, while the security detail was occupied, Oliva slipped free. He ran. A wire service story filed on August 14, 1962, and preserved in the Colorado Historic Newspapers Archive, confirms a defection from the Cuban weightlifting delegation in Kingston on approximately that date. A photograph caption from the Bridgman Images Archive records that the coach and 4 members of the Cuban weightlifting team defected from Cuba while attending the games. Oliva ran at top speed through the streets of Kingston until he reached the American consulate. He arrived breathless. He demanded political asylum. He received it. 2 months later, the Cuban Missile Crisis would bring the United States and the Soviet Union to the edge of nuclear exchange, precipitated by the exact government Oliva had just fled. A young man who had sprinted from Cuban government supervision into the arms of an American consulate in August 1962 wasn't going to be turned away. The political timing was as significant as the physical act. Oliva hadn't simply escaped. He had arrived in American custody at the most charged moment in Cold War history, fleeing the country that was actively terrifying the Western world. That story should have traveled far. A Cuban athlete under Castro's guard, breaking free and running to America. It had everything a Cold War narrative required: the oppressive regime, the free world beckoning, the individual act of courage against state control. It was genuinely cinematic, because it actually happened. It wasn't widely told. He was given asylum and then largely left to manage his own existence. He made it to Chicago, leaving his family behind in Cuba, a fact the historical record notes without elaboration, and the silence around it says something on its own. A man who defected individually can't bring his family. The freedom he chose came with that cost, and the record doesn't tell us what the calculation felt like. What it tells us is where he ended up: a city where he knew almost no one, spoke almost no English, and had nothing financial to fall back on. He found work as a butcher, then in a foundry. Accounts of the exact sequence and specific employers are inconsistent. The records weren't maintained for a Cuban defector in the early 1960s, and Oliva wasn't cataloging himself for posterity. What is consistently documented is the rhythm of those years: brutal physical labor through the day, then training at the Duncan YMCA on Chicago's South Side, 6 days a week, 2 hours each session, after the shifts were done. One interview he gave later described it without self-pity: a factory day, then 3 hours with the weights, then back to the beginning. No sponsor, no financial support from any federation, no photographer documenting the progress for a magazine cover, just a body, an iron, and a YMCA on Chicago's South Side. He had come to the sport as a weightlifter, a discipline concerned with moving the bar, not with how the body looks while doing it. Bodybuilding is different. Bodybuilding is the architecture of the body itself: mass, proportion, the specific mathematics of how much you can carry while remaining something that looks sculpted rather than merely large. What Oliva discovered in those years at the Duncan YMCA was that his body followed different rules than other people's bodies. His waist stayed narrow, while his shoulders and lats expanded outward. He added mass to his upper body without it migrating to his midsection. He built thighs that measured 30 inches while maintaining a waist that measured 28. The numbers describe something that requires a moment to visualize. Most men with 30-inch thighs are carrying more than 28 inches at the waist. Oliva was carrying less. The result was a taper, an expanding V from hip to shoulder, that made the upper body look structurally impossible. The sport didn't have vocabulary for what he was building. It would eventually give that vocabulary a nickname. The press would call him the Myth, because his body looked invented rather than developed, like something from a tradition that required supernatural intervention rather than foundry shifts and a Southside YMCA. Joe and Ben Weider had created the Mr. Olympia competition in 1965, a champions championship restricted to the best bodybuilders from other major titles, designed to establish a definitive world hierarchy and, not incidentally, to give the IFBB organization a flagship event that would anchor the sport's calendar. Oliva qualified through the IFBB professional system and entered the 1967 Olympia in New York. He won it, defeating Chuck Sipes and the rest of the field. Then he won it again in 1968. That second year, the competition was essentially formality. Oliva's reputation had expanded to the point where serious challengers declined to enter. The 1968 Olympia was uncontested because no one wanted to stand next to that physique in a judging lineup. The Myth had become the sport's default. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the Austrian town of Thal, Arnold Schwarzenegger had been chasing international bodybuilding titles since his mid-teens with the focused intensity of someone who had decided very early that ambition was its own form of planning. By 1968, he had won the NABBA Mr. Universe twice and was the most discussed young bodybuilder in Europe. He was 20 years old and had not yet been to America and had not yet won a Mr. Olympia. He had barely heard of the IFBB in any serious professional context. Then Joe Weider sent him a telegram. Arnold described that telegram later as the message that confirmed his master plan, the single communication that pushed him to leave Austria for California. Weider's offer, documented in the East Bay Times in 2007, included an apartment, a car, and a weekly salary. The specific dollar figure was never publicly disclosed, but the structure of the arrangement wasn't ambiguous. Weider wasn't bringing over a promising bodybuilder to see if he could compete. He was acquiring a property. He was doing what studios had been doing with screen talent for decades, identifying potential early, providing the infrastructure of a career before the career had justified that investment, and then exercising considerable influence over how that career was shaped and narrated to the public. Joe Weider, by 1968, held a position in the sport of bodybuilding that had no real parallel in any other athletic discipline. He and his brother Ben had co-founded the International Federation of Bodybuilding. Joe simultaneously served as the organizational head of competitive bodybuilding, controlling who competed, under what rules, and with what consequences for violations, and also controlled the sport's primary media apparatus, Muscle Builder magazine, a cluster of related publications. The entirety of professional bodybuilding's press coverage, essentially, ran through his editorial decisions. There was no firewall between the commissioner of the sport and the journalist covering it, because they were the same man. The Los Angeles Times, reporting on Weider in 1989, noted that he had been accused of running the sport as a monopoly, and he has been the target of false advertising suits by both the Federal Trade Commission. That characterization, published during his lifetime in a mainstream American newspaper, describes the institutional architecture he had spent decades building. When a bodybuilder appeared in Muscle Builder with training features, monthly photo spreads, and editorial profiles, that bodybuilder had a public existence. The magazine's readership was the sport's entire engaged audience. When a bodybuilder disappeared from Muscle Builder, bodybuilding's primary public simply didn't read about them. The magazine didn't reflect the sport's hierarchy, it created it. Oliva appeared in Weider's publications during his championship years. He was featured in a July 1968 weight-gaining article in Muscle Builder. He appeared alongside Frank Zane and Arnold on the cover of the May 1971 issue. He was inside the machine, at least in those years. But there is no documented equivalent of the apartment, the car, the salary. No comparable investment on Weider's part. What Weider gave Arnold when he arrived in 1968 was infrastructure. the physical and financial scaffolding of a career in a foreign country. What Oliva had when he arrived in Chicago in 1962 was his body and the determination not to return to the regime he'd fled. Weider had already cycled through one Golden Boy. Larry Scott, the first Mr. Olympia, had won the title's inaugural 2 editions before retiring in 1966. Randy Roach, whose independent history of bodybuilding, Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors, took more than 5 years and 500 cited references to construct, describes the commercial succession directly. Scott had what Roach calls Golden Boy appeal, a promotable quality that Weider needed in the public face of his sport. Scott's successor, Sergio Oliva, Roach writes, being black and Cuban in the decade of heavy anti-Fidel Castro sentiment and the Cuban Missile Crisis, didn't offer... The sentence trails off in the available excerpt, but the architecture of the argument doesn't require the final word. The Cuban Missile Crisis was October 1962. Oliva had arrived in American custody 2 months before the most acute nuclear confrontation in the country's history, precipitated by the exact government he had fled. He was, in the American imagination of that moment, a refugee from an enemy state, which should have made him sympathetic and didn't, because the specific combination of being black, Cuban, and a limited English speaker in early 1960s America didn't map easily onto the aspirational immigrant narrative that mainstream commercial culture could absorb and sell. The bodybuilding press of the era wasn't subtle about racial framing. Arnold was Austrian. He spoke English with an accent that American audiences processed as European and charming rather than foreign and alienating. He was constitutionally incapable of entering a room without making everyone in it aware he had arrived. His charisma was documentary grade. It didn't require interpretation. Weider's commercial reasoning wasn't complicated, and it wasn't unique to bodybuilding. Academic historians documenting American sports media in the 1960s and 1970s have identified institutionalized racial inequalities in the business of sports operating through the entire era, with informal racial quotas shaping which athletes received promotional investment and which didn't. Weider wasn't inventing those dynamics. He was applying them with the leverage available to a man who ran both the federation and its press. Arnold's immigrant story fit a template. The Austrian farm boy who came to America through talent and will and became its greatest champion. That narrative was legible to the mainstream audience Weider needed to sell supplements and magazines to. Oliva's story was more genuinely dramatic in every measurable way. A literal sprint to an embassy, a family left behind on an island he couldn't return to, a physique built without any institutional support during foundry shifts in a city that didn't know he existed. But that story required the promotional machinery to reach the audience it deserved. The machinery was otherwise occupied. The collision of those two trajectories arrived on September 13, 1969, at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in Brooklyn, New York. Arnold was 22. This was his first Mr. Olympia. He had been in America for 1 year, living on Weider's support, training with the specific focus of someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply executing the plan to reach it. He had won NABA Mr. Universe titles. He had established himself as the most talked-about young bodybuilder in the sport. Entering the Brooklyn Academy of Music that September night, he later wrote, he came in the way I had been going in every place lately, like I was just taking over. Then he walked backstage and saw Sergio Oliva. Arnold described the moment in The Education of a Bodybuilder. It was as jarring as if I'd walked into a wall. He destroyed me. He was so huge. He was so fantastic. There was no way I could even think of beating him. That isn't a rival's campaign rhetoric. That is the man himself, in his own autobiography, describing the physical reality of standing near Sergio Oliva in a backstage room in Brooklyn. The physique Arnold encountered measured 5 feet 10 inches and 240 pounds, 22-inch arms, 30-inch thighs, a 28-inch waist. The waist is the number that does the most interpretive work. Most men carrying that much upper body mass carry considerably more than 28 inches at the midsection. Oliva's midsection was narrower than many women wore as a dress size. The resulting taper, from the exceptional breadth of his back and shoulders down to that almost structurally implausible waist, produced a visual effect that the sport's judges had never seen in combination with that kind of raw mass. He wasn't just large, he was large in a way that simultaneously looked carved, the mass and the proportion coexisting in defiance of the ordinary rules of how bodies accumulate tissue. Oliva won. The contest's first ever pose down occurred at that event, the two men standing side by side in front of the audience, which had to decide what it was watching. The judging breakdown is widely cited across bodybuilding historiography as a 4-3 decision in Oliva's favor, though the specific scorecard hasn't surfaced in public archives. What isn't in dispute is the outcome: Oliva's third consecutive Mr. Olympia, Arnold's first major competitive defeat on the biggest stage the sport offered. Oliva's own description of that contest, given years later in a Flex magazine interview, ran to exactly 14 words. "I had no real competition until 1969 when Arnold showed up. I beat him." 3 words for the climax: I beat him. No elaboration, no drama. The same economy of language he brought to everything. He knew what had happened in that room, and he didn't require additional sentences to explain it. Arnold won the 1970 Olympia, and the result was credibly contested. A record audience of 5,000 attended. Judges found themselves unable to definitively separate the two physiques, pushing the competitors through a pose down that extended until both men walked off the stage exhausted. The margin, whatever it was numerically, didn't read as definitive to the people in the building. Arnold also defeated Oliva at the 1970 AAU Professional Mr. World. 2 losses in a year for Oliva, both narrow, both debated, both consistent with the portrait of a rivalry in genuine balance. That balance ended in 1971, not through competition, through paperwork. Sergio Oliva entered the 1971 NABA Mr. Universe. NABA, the National Amateur Bodybuilding Association, operated its own competition circuit independent of the IFBB. It wasn't a fringe organization. It was the primary bodybuilding federation before Weider's IFBB achieved dominance, and it continued running major international events through the 1970s. Oliva placed second in the tall category at that 1971 NABA contest, losing to Bill Pearl. The NABA event took place 1 week before the 1971 Mr. Olympia. The IFBB responded by implementing what it called a non-sanctioned policy. The rule, as documented by Old School Labs in its historical account of the period, stated plainly, if anyone competed in a non-sanctioned IFBB event, they would be suspended from competing in the IFBB for a full year. Sergio Oliva Jr., in later interviews about his father, distilled the mechanism with 3 words: Joe makes a rule. Present tense, after the fact. The rule wasn't pre-existing policy that Oliva had violated by attending NABBA. Historical reconstruction of the period indicates it was reactive legislation, created specifically because of Oliva's NABA appearance, not before it. The timing makes the direction of causality clear. The rule existed because Oliva had already competed, not Oliva competed and was caught violating an existing rule. Rather, Oliva competed and then a rule was written to punish him for it. Oliva was barred from competing at the 1971 Mr. Olympia. He was permitted to appear as a guest poser. He could stand on the stage he had occupied for 3 consecutive years, in front of the audience that had watched him build the most dominant physique in the sport's history, and watch from outside the competition. Arnold Schwarzenegger won the 1971 Olympia unopposed. No credible challenger present. The title defense was administrative rather than athletic. Now consider the context that makes this untenable as neutral enforcement. Arnold Schwarzenegger had been competing in NABA Pro Universe events since 1968. He had won the NABA Pro Universe title beginning that year and competed in it through the subsequent years. One contemporaneous source states directly that Schwarzenegger had competed in this very same contest the year before, the same NABA event that produced Oliva's suspension. A YouTube documentary from the era carries the title, Arnold Schwarzenegger Risked Suspension from the IFBB in 1971, suggesting Arnold faced a real choice about whether to defend his NABA title knowing the new rule existed. He navigated that moment without suspension. Oliva didn't. The asymmetry is documented. Both men had NABBA competition history. One was suspended, one wasn't. The one who wasn't suspended was the one Weider had brought to America, housed, paid, and positioned as the sport's future face. Randy Roach, in Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors, titled the chapter covering this period, Arnold's Cuban Muscle Crisis. That framing, a deliberate Cold War echo, signals what Roach found when 5 years of primary research led him to examine the specific sequence of events between 1969 and 1972. A sustained effort to remove the primary competitive obstacle to the athlete Weider was constructing as bodybuilding's defining figure. Oliva himself wasn't diplomatic about the interpretation. The suspension was just kind of an excuse, he said. He didn't believe the rule was the cause. He believed the rule was the instrument, and the cause was the decision that had already been made about who the sport needed at its center and who it needed out of the way. What the 1971 season looked like, stripped of euphemism. The three-time defending Mr. Olympia champion was suspended on a rule created after the act it punished, while his principal rival competed in the same rival federation without consequence, and the resulting championship was decided without a competition. The ban technically expired before the 1972 season, and this is where the machinery's logic reveals itself most clearly. Weider, according to Oliva's account, wanted him in Essen. A 1971 title won against empty air had limited commercial value. Arnold needed to defeat Sergio Oliva on a stage in a genuine contest to consolidate his claim as the sport's undisputed champion. The trophy required a challenger to have meaning. So Oliva was permitted to return, not out of fairness, but out of necessity. Oliva understood the calculation. He came anyway, because his physique was better, and because for a man who had run across a Kingston street in 1962, retreat had never been an available option. The 1972 Mr. Olympia took place in Essen, Germany. Official results, documented in the Muscle Memory Competition database. First, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Second, Sergio Oliva. Third, Serge Nubret. Fourth, Frank Zane. Fifth, Franco Columbu. 5 competitors whose names would define the sport's golden era, on one stage, at one event. On paper, that reads as a clean result. Oliva arrived in Essen in extraordinary condition. Witnesses described insane accumulated mass, a waist that had stayed freakishly narrow, powerful legs, a back that seemed to extend beyond the structural limits of human anatomy.
He stood 4 inches shorter than Arnold, a height differential that became, according to Oliva, a deliberate staging decision rather than a neutral physical fact. Organizers, he claimed, positioned the taller Arnold in front of him during comparisons, maximizing the visual advantage of the height gap and minimizing the visual impact of Oliva's superior mass. He was explicit and consistent on one critical point. Arnold wasn't responsible for the staging. He clarified that Schwarzenegger wasn't in on it. The setup came from the people running the contest, not from his rival. This distinction mattered to Oliva, and he never dropped it. He wasn't accusing Arnold of personal dishonesty. He was accusing the apparatus around Arnold of engineering the environment before the poses were ever struck. The judging breakdown in the available record is conflicted. Sources describe both a narrow split and a more decisive margin for Arnold, and the total number of judges, their names, and their organizational affiliations aren't documented in public records. What is documented is what the people inside that building believed they saw. Frank Zane, who competed on that Essen stage and placed 4th, stated afterward that Sergio had beaten Arnold that night. He described Oliva's unmatched shape with lines, proportions, and conditioning that put the final result in doubt. Jerry Brainham, a bodybuilding historian of that era, stated flatly that Sergio should have won over Arnold Schwarzenegger at the 1972 contest. Historians and competitors who witnessed the golden era have described, in retrospective accounts, a near consensus that Oliva presented the superior physique in Germany. And then there is Arnold's own admission, cited across multiple independent sources. If I had been judging Germany, I would have voted in favor of Oliva over me. The man holding the trophy said he wouldn't have given it to himself.
That isn't a gracious loser formulation from a competitor who came close. That is the winner of a contested result acknowledging, in his own words, that the result may not have reflected what happened on the stage. Weider's documented involvement in IFBB judging during this period adds relevant context. At a 1973 IFBB contest, 1 year after Essen, Oliva himself verified that Weider had shown up with 3 of his own judges, including himself, which made 4 members of the judging panel. That is a single documented instance, 1 year removed from the 1972 Olympia, not direct evidence of the same arrangement in Germany. But it establishes that Weider's presence on IFBB judging panels wasn't unusual, that his capacity to shape outcomes through judge selection was real, and that the practice was documented in his own organization's events. Oliva didn't use diplomatic language about Essen. He didn't call the result controversial or unfortunate or regrettable. He used the word rigged. And he directed his accusation with surgical precision. I was beaten by the judges and the Joe Weider IFBB organization, not by Arnold. He said that in interviews. He said it in his autobiography. He said it until kidney failure ended the argument for him in November 2012. The claim, the distinction, and the target remained identical across 40 years. After Essen, Oliva left the IFBB. He joined Dan Lurie's World Bodybuilding Guild, the WBBG, Weider's main commercial rival. Lurie had been running the WBBG since 1967, operating a parallel circuit with its own titles and its own competitive calendar. When Oliva came over, the bodybuilding underground recognized what it meant. The 3-time Mr. Olympia, the man who had beaten Arnold Schwarzenegger on the biggest stage in the sport, was now competing outside Weider's jurisdiction. Oliva won the WBBG Mr. Galaxy in 1972 and again in 1973. Neither title generated sustained coverage in Muscle Builder. A champion competing outside the IFBB was a champion the IFBB's press didn't discuss in any sustained way, which meant a champion the sport's mainstream audience didn't read about. This is how the erasure worked in practice. It didn't require a deliberate blacklist. It required only that the organization's media apparatus follow its own institutional logic. We cover our sport, and our sport is what we say it's. Sergio Oliva competing in the WBBG wasn't, by that logic, part of the story Muscle Builder was telling. In 1977, Pumping Iron completed what the magazine coverage had begun. The documentary followed Arnold's preparation for the 1975 Mr. Olympia. It captured his psychological gamesmanship with competitors, his theatrical charisma, his absolute certainty about his own greatness. The film became a cultural artifact, the primary document through which people who didn't follow bodybuilding encountered the sport for the first time. Its influence on mainstream perception of the golden era was total. Arnold emerged from it as an undeniable protagonist. The film's frame included the competitors Arnold was actively defeating. It didn't include Sergio Oliva. Oliva wasn't competing at the 1975 IFBB Olympia. He wasn't in the footage. He wasn't part of the story Pumping Iron was telling. And the story Pumping Iron told became the story most people know. You can't accuse a documentary of omitting someone who wasn't present. That's the precise mechanism. The suspension. The WBBG years. The structural absence from IFBB events during exactly the period that a major documentary was capturing the sport. These created the conditions for a retrospective narrative that simply didn't include him. The erasure didn't require malice in the editing room. It required only that the prior institutional decisions had already achieved their purpose. In Chicago, Oliva kept working. He served as a Chicago Police Department officer for decades, a fact confirmed by the Tribune's obituary, which identified him at his death as a retired CPD officer. The decades of service weren't glamorous public-facing work. They were Chicago beats, shift work, a civil servant's career that paid a consistent wage without the fluctuations of prize money and sponsorship. He trained alongside all of it. The workouts didn't stop when the competitive circuit dried up. His body remained extraordinary, even as the bodybuilding industry that had benefited from his dominance focused its coverage elsewhere. In 1984, at 43 years old, Oliva returned to compete at the Mr. Olympia. The sport had changed around him. Lee Haney was ascending toward the era of mass that would dominate the next decade. The audience was different. The competitive field was different.
His specific placing in that 1984 contest isn't captured in the available documentation. What the act of returning communicates doesn't require a finishing position. A 43-year-old man, 4 inches shorter than most of his competition, who had spent 3 years of his prime suspended from the sport, who had been structurally excluded from the documentary that defined the era in public memory, returning to the stage where his career had been contested and partially stolen. The 1984 comeback wasn't about winning, it was about presence, about refusing to stay in the absence the machinery had arranged for him. 2 years later, in 1986, Oliva was shot during a domestic dispute. He survived. The specific legal and personal circumstances of that night are thin in the public record, and they deserve the restraint appropriate to events that intersect violence and privacy simultaneously. What the record shows is survival. A man who had already survived a Cuban regime, a defection sprint through Kingston streets, a decade of career suppression and reputational erasure, still alive when the paramedics arrived.
He went back to work after recovering. He continued giving interviews in which his account of 1972 had not softened by a single syllable. In his later years, when journalists asked about his place in the sport's history, Oliva was consistent and completely clear-eyed. He understood exactly where he stood in the IFBB's official narrative, and he understood why. He offered in one interview a line that suggests both self-awareness and grim humor. One of the worst questions you can ask is, do you think you were the best Mr. Olympia? Of course you do. You have to. He knew what he had built. He knew what had been taken, and he knew the difference between the two. Arnold Schwarzenegger, for his part, never minimized Oliva in his own writing. In the New Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding, a book with Arnold's name on the cover and his voice throughout, he wrote, "Anytime people discuss who might be the best bodybuilder of all time, the name Sergio Oliva inevitably comes up. He and I had some unbelievable confrontations on stage." That's not a dismissal. That's the man who inherited the sport's promotional apparatus, placing his primary rival in the company of the sport's all-time elite in his own publication. Arnold's acknowledgement of Oliva's greatness was real and documented and repeated. What Arnold never did was acknowledge the institutional dimension, the suspension, the staging, the judging panel composition at IFBB events. His admissions were personal and sporting. They confirmed Oliva's greatness without confirming the system's manipulation. The distinction matters because it allowed Arnold to be gracious about a man while remaining silent about the machinery that benefited him. Joe Weider outlived Oliva by 4 months. He died in March 2013. He built the most commercially successful bodybuilding organization in the sport's history. He made Arnold Schwarzenegger a global figure by providing the infrastructure and the promotional apparatus when Arnold was a 20-year-old Austrian with ambitions too large for Europe. His legacy across bodybuilding is genuinely complicated. The LA Times had documented accusations of monopoly and false advertising in 1989, and his total institutional control over the sport was acknowledged even by people who benefited from it. Weider wasn't a simple villain. He was a shrewd businessman operating within the commercial logic of his era, making calculated decisions about which assets to invest in and which to allow to fade. The decisions he made had racial dimensions. They had financial dimensions, and they were made by a man with enough organizational control to turn those decisions into outcomes. What Oliva represents in that ledger isn't the only grievance, but it may be the most clearly structured. A 3-time champion suspended on a rule that post-dated the act it punished, judged by panels the organization's founder had populated, and then largely absent from the narrative the organization and its media apparatus produced for public consumption. The sequence is documented. The pattern is coherent. Whether it was conscious policy or institutional habit operating within the racial commerce of its era, the effect on Oliva's legacy was the same. Sergio Oliva died on November 12, 2012, in Chicago, of kidney failure. He was 71. He was survived by his son Sergio Jr. and his daughter Julia. Sergio Jr. became a competitive professional bodybuilder, carrying his father's name onto the same circuit that had spent decades engineering his father's absence from its own mythology. The Chicago Tribune ran the story under a headline that deserves its own sentence. "Retired Chicago cop dies, only bodybuilder to beat Schwarzenegger." A major American newspaper,
writing about a three-time Mr. Olympia champion and a Cuban defection story as dramatic as anything in Cold War history. And the detail the editors reached for, the thing they decided would tell readers who this person was a single loss on someone else's record. Not Oliva's 3 consecutive titles, not the defection sprint through Kingston in 1962, not 3 decades of Chicago police service. The fact that cut through everything for the Tribune's editors was his relationship to Arnold Schwarzenegger's career, the man who handed Arnold his only Olympia defeat. That is a precise measurement of how completely Sergio Oliva had been written out of the sport's primary narrative. His defining characteristic in mainstream coverage was his function in someone else's story rather than his own. He had 3 Olympia titles, a genuine American immigrant story that was more cinematically dramatic than anything the sport's promotional machinery had bothered to construct around him, and a working life of physical and moral discipline that ran from a foundry in Chicago to 30-plus years on the city's police force. What the Tribune reached for was, he beat the famous guy once. Arnold mentioned Oliva in a post on Twitter following the news of his death, a brief public tribute, which isn't nothing and is also not sufficient accounting. The word myth does 2 different things, and Sergio Oliva's life occupied both. A myth, in the first sense, is something so far beyond ordinary categories that it seems invented rather than real, something that appears to require supernatural explanation because the natural explanation doesn't feel adequate. A 28-inch waist on a 240-pound frame, 22-inch arms and 30-inch thighs, a back wide enough that Frank Zane, who stood on a stage next to it in Essen in 1972, described it as unmatched in lines and proportions. A body that made Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most confident man in competitive bodybuilding, described the experience of standing near it as walking into a wall. That body wasn't a myth in the sense of being false. It was mythological in the sense that it exceeded the vocabulary of ordinary achievement. The sport called it the myth because nothing in its existing language was large enough. A myth, in the second sense, is something that has been made unreal. A true event converted into silence by the people with the power to shape what gets remembered. When a man wins 3 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, and the sports media apparatus covers his subsequent absence as an unremarkable administrative pause, he has been made into a myth in this second sense. When a rule is written after the fact to punish him for something his rival did without consequence, and the resulting championship is handed to that rival unopposed, the history being produced is a myth, a constructed narrative serving an institutional purpose rather than reflecting what actually happened. When 50 years of golden-era bodybuilding documentation positions Arnold as the undisputed protagonist, without reckoning with the man Arnold himself admitted he wouldn't have beaten in Germany, that is myth-making in the political sense. The arrangement of events into a shape that serves the people doing the arranging. Sergio Oliva defected from one regime that tried to own him. He ran through the streets of Kingston in August 1962, with Cuban security forces somewhere behind him and an American consulate door in front of him, and he chose the door. He built a life in Chicago out of foundry shifts and butcher work, and 2 hours every night at the Duncan YMCA, without the apartment or the car or the salary that the industry's power structure was simultaneously providing to his eventual rival. He built the most visually dominant physique the sport had ever seen, quantified, documented, witnessed, and ultimately confirmed by the man who benefited most from the machinery that suppressed him. He survived being shot. He survived being suspended on a rule constructed to stop him. He survived the erasure that followed the 1972 result, the WBBG years, the pumping iron narrative that didn't include him, the decades in which bodybuilding's public memory was curated by the organization that had benefited from his absence. He kept saying exactly what he believed, in exactly the same words, until his kidneys gave out in a Chicago hospital in the 3rd week of November 2012. The sport built its defining mythology around someone else. That doesn't mean the wrong person became the myth. It means the wrong person received the marketing infrastructure. History produced by an organization's promotional apparatus isn't the same as history. And the man who won 3 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, defected from Castro's Cuba in a sprint to an American consulate, and worked 30-plus years as a Chicago cop while the sport arranged its memory without him? That man isn't a footnote in Arnold Schwarzenegger's story. Arnold said it himself. In Germany in 1972, he would have voted for Oliva. The rest is what institutions do when they decide whose name gets on the trophy. Subscribe for more stories like this.